My name's Reishi. Yeah, my main interest in fungi is just using fungi for healing of like our bodies and our ecosystems and our culture and yeah, really like our culture. And I see psychoactive fungi as being a really potent tool in helping us evolve both individually and culturally, collectively. I just feel, yeah, so out of all the mushrooms I've worked with, psilocybin has been one of the most potent tools for evolution, like evolving my own self and my thoughts, and also culture, like a type of culture I can conceive of and how to relate to each other. And yeah, my background is in medicinal mushrooms. I went to Bastyr. Welcome. I went to Bastyr and got my bachelor's of science in herbal science and took a lot of classes in pharmacology, herb drug interactions, medicinal plants, botany, anatomy, physiology, a lot of sciencey things. So yeah, I like science and I like intuition. And above all, I really like finding tools to help us heal individually and collectively. So yeah. How about healing?
Yeah.
Cool. Take it away, Greg.
All right. My name is Steinruck. I'm essentially obsessed with fungi. Essentially. Yeah. And it started probably 16 years ago. I was cooking professionally and really interested in the wild mushrooms that grow in the Rocky Mountains from Colorado. So that got me really, really excited about mushrooms in general, just in the kitchen. And then I would say sometime in high school, my experiences with psilocybin containing mushrooms definitely changed. As you were saying, like, I feel it's really like molded me into the person that I am. And definitely helped me with a lot of things mentally, as well as drug addiction. So that's partly my interest in psilocybin mushrooms. And I'm also a certified mycologist or a mushroom expert in Colorado. I study and identify mushrooms for sale to restaurants. And I also volunteer at the Telluride Mushroom Festival as well. So that's about me.
Hi, everybody. I'm William Padilla-Brown. I grew up kind of crazy, traveling all over the world. Both my parents worked for the government. My father worked for the Army. My mother worked for the foreign USDA services. And they pulled within a lot of cultural programming, which I don't blame them for. I mean, we all grew up in the same kind of situation, and a lot of our parents grew up with limited access to information in comparison to what we have now. So I grew up with, like, I don't know, you just say no, and all substances are bad. And I grew up a lot with my grandparents. Both my parents traveled a lot. And whenever I was in my early teens, my grandfather, who I was really close to, I had to help him as he transitioned to death. And it was very uncomfortable for him. He had cancer. Both my grandparents on my mother's side died of cancer, and those were my grandparents who I was really close with. And around that time, I started noticing kids in my high school were using cannabis, and I thought through going through the DARE program that that's something that could potentially kill you or be very harmful to you. And my parents reinforced that understanding. And I noticed that my fellow students in high school they didn't look like they were unhealthy. They were playing basketball, they were getting good grades, and they were using cannabis. And I thought that those things weren't things that went hand in hand. So I went on Google. I had considered trying it. I really liked this girl, and she would smoke weed after school, and I wanted to know if it was something that would harm me if I tried it. So I went on Google and I looked it up, and I saw that cannabis could help aid people that are going through chemotherapy and can help heal people that have various cancers and things of this nature, and my whole worldview shifted. Everything seemed wrong. Everything I knew about the world seemed wrong. I grew up Christian and believed that humans were made as humans and didn't evolve from anything else. And I started to see myself as an animal. I started to have very psychedelic type experiences completely sober before trying any of these substances. My whole world was changing around me. So I started to learn about these things and tried these substances, and I found that cannabis did the opposite of what everybody said it did. It actually helped me to learn things, and I kind of fell off the grid of what people expected of me. I stopped going to school and I stayed home and started learning about things that I thought were more beneficial. Eventually I dropped out of school and became an atheist, and I felt as though something was missing in my life, and that's something that I eventually found out was something more spiritual connection aside from the scientific literature and scientific studies that I was working with. And around that time, I felt that mushrooms would help me find the thing that I was missing in my life. I became more comfortable with it, seeing artists that were my age putting it in their music and translating it through their art. And I figured, hey, if they didn't go crazy, maybe I won't go crazy. And like that whole cannabis thing was safe. Maybe this might be something that's safe as well. So in trying the mushrooms, everything changed about me. I was able to move through the cultural programming and kind of take a step back and meta-program this biocomputer, so to speak, and remove and drag and drop the terrible programming into the recycling bin and stick with the things that were more beneficial to me. So that's my relationship with psychoactive mushrooms, and coming from a place where I didn't see nature, where I didn't see trees. I grew up in cities, and being able to walk outside and actually see the ecosystem and see the trees and see the animals and see the other organisms. Through those experiences, I think that might be something beneficial to all these other people that are living in these cities that have no idea about the nature in themselves and the nature outside of themselves. So that's my relationship with mushrooms, and we'll probably talk about all that stuff more.
Cool. Thank you, Will.
Yeah, thank you, Will. Hello, my name is Raskal Turbeville. I grew up in, for a second I thought it was like a laugh. I was like, that was it is my real name. It's my birth name. I think my mom's on the live stream right now. She's partially responsible. Hi, Mom. She's partially responsible for slipping up and making a joke that she should name her son Raskal. And my dad was stubborn enough to be like, that's it. That's the perfect name. You said it. You can't go back. But so I grew up in Southern California. I didn't know a lot about mushrooms growing up. Southern California, until you start to learn a lot about the ecology of fungi, Southern California seems like a fungal desert in a lot of respects. But growing up, didn't know a lot about fungi other than magic mushrooms. The first time I tried magic mushrooms was when I was 13 years old. I ate about 4 grams and went up with some friends into the hills directly above Ojai, and we just ran around the hills all day. And it was just one of the most amazing experiences I'd ever had. It felt so good. I felt more athletic. I felt smarter, felt more happy and awake and alive. And I was making all of these connections about the ecology around me. And my sense of curiosity and wonder was just like blown wide open, especially at a time as a teenager when I felt my curiosity was starting to like close in a lot of respects because I was so fed up with the way the world was going, fed up with school. And so it really just blew me open. We spent the whole day out there. To get back, we had to like walk through thickets of poison oak, but it was just so fun and we were laughing the whole way. And I get home, I walk into the driveway and my mom is there and she's looking at me. And I'm like, what's up, Mom? And she's like, I have never seen you this happy. Like, you look so ecstatic. And I'm like, I had a great day. And later I was like, no, I was tripping pretty hard on mushrooms, and that's why I'm so happy. And it has helped me so much in my life to open up my perspective to the world around me, and to just open up my perspective around ecology and around the natural world, where it seems so much so much easier and like so much more like duh that all of these things are connected. The intricacies and the fractalization of the ecology is just so much more apparent, and it goes from being something that's complicated to something that's complex, but it's very attainable through what you can see. And so I truly believe in the medicine that is there for all people, whether you're specifically suffering from something or if you just want to be a more functional and aware human being. I currently run a mushroom farm, co-run a mushroom farm in Olympia, Washington. My junior year of high school, after having this experience, I then saw Paul Stamets speak and was like, "Where'd you go to school?" He's like, "I went to Evergreen." And I was like, "I got you. That's where I'm going." After 2 years, I dropped out of Evergreen because I wasn't learning enough and traveled around the country, learning with different mycologists, Peter McCoy, Jay Schindler, a couple others, and then also traveling a little bit in Central America doing mycology work. Eventually landed back in the Northwest and started working for my friend and co-teacher of the Olympia Mycelial Network, which is a group down in Olympia that is focused on destigmatizing mushrooms and breaking down mycophobia, just expanding awareness about the beauty of the fungal world and what they can do to benefit humans and other species. And so I became her first employee, volunteer, and then I eventually partnered with the business, and we bought a 5-acre farm 2 years ago. Pretty crazy, a turn of life events. And so I've been doing the full-time mushroom farmer thing for about 2 years. The name of our farm for business is Feral Fungi, also known as Myco Uprisal. We primarily sell fresh mushrooms and mushroom kits to the greater Olympia area, and we do a lot of teaching as well. So I've taken the blood oath, so to speak. My work with fungi is a very enjoyable obligation, and they, kind of pull the strings and tell me to share that knowledge with the people freely. It's always nice when I can support myself a little bit doing it, but the information is meant to be shared at the end of the day. And that's a little bit about me and why I'm here.
Aww.
Yeah.
You guys are so cool.
I love all of you. My name is Cassandra Posey. I run a little company called Cognitive Function. And I do a lot of work with William, my beautiful little babes. I focus primarily, and I guess my background lies more in my upbringing. I feel like all of it. Is it?
Yeah, that's my
Hey.
business partner. My business partner.
Oh my gosh, hi!
Wish you were here.
She's
Maybe she
here
can hang out on
through
Facebook.
technology.
I think the common underlier in a lot of this is upbringing and like where things stem from at a young age, and I resonate a lot with that. When I was young, I was told that I couldn't sit straight in a chair and pay attention in class, as I'm sure some of you have experienced. And I was shoved in the corner or shoved in tiny classrooms with other kids dealing with the same problems, and from a young age was dosed on high amounts of Adderall or Ritalin, and then with that came a cocktail of other issues, depression medication, anxiety medication, and for the good half of my childhood development on through adolescence and adulthood, I was told that those were just my realities. And I was never ready to accept that. That's a really difficult thing I think that a lot of people deal with in their day-to-day life. I was fortunate enough to have parents and family members who supported me in different ways and believed that, we can help set you up and you can kind of just take it where you're going to go with that. And majority of my work now is focused on helping people get back to a more holistic lifestyle and adapting to different natural remedies and what are the best ways that we can overcome things that we've been through from a pharmaceutical standpoint. So William and I do a lot of medicine making on that front, and I've used psilocybin in the past for microdose amounts to try to overcome anxiety and depression. And I know I lived in Seattle for a long period of my life. I know you guys probably go through this, but that can be something that just happens in everyone's life here in this city. But I think it's super important to talk about mental health. I'm a huge mental health advocate. And with that comes a deeper knowledge and understanding of agriculture and getting outside. And we say far too often that half of the medicine is really getting outdoors and experiencing what that has to offer you. And so I just think that that's a huge part of what makes this so special. And it's free. It doesn't cost you $225 in prescriptions each month. So that's my story. All the film fun.
Cool. Yeah, I think it's just an honor to be here with all of you guys, creating, revolutionizing culture. So, yeah, next maybe we can talk a bit about the history of psychoactive fungi and yeah, our culture and other cultures, indigenous uses, Mayan relationships and applications of psychoactive fungi.
I mean, I think most of it starts with like those of us that believe in stone age theory to begin like anthropological history. I mean, I'm sure pre-anthropological history there was all sorts of other mammals that were utilizing psychoactive fungi. I mean, even if we just think about how I mean, nobody really knows why mushrooms produce psilocybin. It's not like it's attracting something or it's deterring something from eating it.
No seeming function.
It does. It's possibly a neurotoxin to some types of rodents.
Potentially.
Potentially.
But from what we understand about other mushrooms like truffles that produce cannabinoids, and they don't have any receptors for them, they evolved around the time that mammals were developing cannabinoid receptors, and it may have been something that was beneficial for the neurological growth of the animals. So maybe we could theorize that it's something along those lines, but there's a lot of great minds that do believe in what we call the stone age theory, that the evolving hominids on our planet following animals for hunting were consuming psilocybin mushrooms that they were finding in the dung of those animals. And that might be part of the reason why their brains grew so much. And if you look at it in like a historical like standpoint, around the time that hominids would have been following animals for hunting them, they would have started eating those said animals, and eating animals incorporates cooking at some point. So like all of those factors, like eating that substance that has a lot of vitamins and minerals and things like that they wouldn't find elsewhere in nature where they were, cooking their food and consuming psychoactive compounds that are known to create more connections in your brain, might have led to our greater understanding of why the brain evolved the way it did. I mean, for anybody that has taken some sort of psychoactive substance, I mean, if you go to any of the blogs or the Arrowhead and things like that, people take these substances, and a lot of a commonly occurring theme that you'll see is when people take higher amounts of these substances, they'll say, I felt as though something spoke to me. I felt as though angels spoke to me or God spoke to me. So if you can only imagine a primitive hominid species that hasn't developed any linguistic skills yet, taking a substance that causes something greater than them to speak to them when they might have never been spoken to before, might have induced some level of linguistic synapses and higher advanced their capabilities of communication to a higher level, which part of the reason why our brain is so big is to be able to process linguistics. Like a big portion of our brain is utilized for communication. So I mean, I think there is some fact and some truth to that theory, but at the end of the day, we don't know. But with all the great minds that do believe that that's true, I think that that's a really great starting point for a known history of psychoactive fungi use.
Most definitely. I think it makes a lot of sense. I had one experience in like particular when I was in high school, where I was with a group of friends and we had ingested some things, and we were there together and pretty deep in it. And it got to a point where we kind of stopped speaking English to each other. We're mostly probably like grunting and stuff, but it really felt like we were communicating very complex ideas across to each other. Where my friend was like, okay, you all stay here. I'm gonna go up to the house because I have another friend who's coming. I need to like get them settled, and then I'll come back down here. And it was like, and I was like, got it, Reishi. I totally understand you. So it makes a lot of sense that this substance would start to help develop linguistics. It makes a lot of sense to me. And there are lots of other animals who ingest those substances as well, and probably, contributes to the development of a lot of species, I imagine.
Yeah, we're definitely not the first species to like pursue psychoactive plants, fungi, lichen to alter our consciousness. There's like a record of like, I don't know how many, but quite a lot of different mammals and animals that intentionally pursue like time and time again psychoactive plants and mushrooms. So yeah, we're not the first species to do this, and we're also definitely not the first culture of humans to consume psychoactive fungi. There's a lot of indigenous use of psychoactive fungi, especially in like Mesoamerica and Mayan culture. Psychoactive mushrooms was a huge sacrament in their culture and way of life. And I don't know a whole lot, but I know that they would combine psilocybin, cacao, and cayenne all together a lot, with the kind of baseline idea that the cacao, it's kind of a vasodilator that's specific for the heart, and that it's like a coronary vasodilator, so it brings more life force and blood into your heart. And then cayenne is like a circulatory stimulant and it helps to circulate medicine and compounds throughout your entire bloodstream. So using those things all together, and they're delicious, and just chocolate and mushrooms is a really great combination.
Just real quick, chocolates, cacaos, and MAO.
Oh yeah. You want to talk about what you mean by that?
Monoamide inhibitor. It
You
allows,
actually know what this stands for.
it allows substances it allows psychoactive substances to last longer, and it's almost like a potentiator. And it is actually utilized in Western pharmacology for different anxiety, depression, things of that nature. It can actually convert psilocybin into more of a DMT-like molecule and make a psilocybin experience more like a dimethyltryptamine experience that lasts for about 6 hours versus a 15-20 minute session.
Such as like Syrian rue combination with psilocybin, which I've seen mixed results with that combination, because all of a sudden your brain isn't kind of like an SSRI where it's blocking the uptake of the or the psilocybin or psilocin that's in your bloodstream and in your brain. So when it gets to the receptor picks it up and then drops it back off instead of utilizing it. So it lasts a lot longer and could potentially be a lot stronger in that format. Which is also a quick side note, if you're taking those kinds of things, that pharma drugs like SSRIs, like you gotta be really careful because they act like MAO inhibitors when you.
Yeah, you definitely gotta be careful for anybody that's taking any other like mind altering antidepressants, anti-anxiety, or anything like that when you're taking any kind of psychoactive substance. One other thing I'd like to add on to that statement about the indigenous use of MAOIs is that every single continent and every single indigenous culture has what we would like to call like an ayahuasca analog which is not always like directly like a DMT type plant. But Hebrews have tradition of combining different plants and herbs and I don't know fungi, but and combining them and creating what we would know as an ayahuasca analog. Every single indigenous culture found an MAOI inhibitor and another psychoactive plant that, when combined, created a long-lasting DMT ayahuasca type experience. And I mean, I've looked into this more with the Hebrew culture, which I have Hebrew tattoos on my hand, which I find very interesting for stories like Moses in the burning bush and things of that nature, which are incredibly psychoactive type experiences. And even nowadays when people take psychoactives, they're like, I see God, and maybe they might not have been Christian, or maybe they might be following some other religion and things of that nature. But I think a lot of those type of angelic communications and things of those nature were developed through these types of substances being consumed. And when we look at languages like Chinese or Aramaic or Sanskrit, Tibetan, Egyptian, Hebrew, a lot of those are, if you utilize those languages under the influence of psychoactive substances, the way that you move your mouth and the way that the sounds come out is almost like neuro-linguistic programming. Like those languages were developed out of a higher understanding of brain waves to control the way that your brain waves are functioning to elevate those experiences for maybe communication with divine intelligence, whatever that might be. So I think that's a really interesting, and I don't know if that directly correlates to psychoactive fungi, because I know not all cultures were utilizing the fungi for those experiences, but some of them were, and I think that's a really important thing to note.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I think too, like the innate ecology, like the ecology of the mushroom itself, like we're talking about, like, you know, mammals ingesting these fungi, like, you know, it's on a different note, like the cow, we were talking about this in the woods, like the cow, you know, where the animal has a defecation, out of that comes these mushrooms. It's pretty obvious that the animals are going to eat these mushrooms, and or did they eat the mushrooms to cause the mushrooms to already be in the dung, which is just like, I mean, those are just postulations, but it's just the ecology also interests me, and just the innate sense of like how connected these things are to mammals.
Was there a question near
MAOI, a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, it inhibits like the enzymes from breaking down the substances faster.
Yeah, what kind of animals regularly eat psychoactive mushrooms? I feel like that was said earlier.
Reindeer, yeah, the
Reindeer,
Amanita,
like a lot of ruminant
Santa
animals.
Squirrels.
Squirrels definitely eat mushrooms, but you'll notice a lot of like deer and elk and a lot of ruminating animals that have multiple stomach or eat a lot of grass and things like that. They'll typically be eating those kind of fungi. Do you remember the gentleman that was at New Moon Mycology Summit that spoke about how in Mexico he would consume psychoactive substances when he was a child?
He did that in the United States.
In the United States,
Yeah.
but it's traditional.
He
in Mexico.
had his first experience when he was 12.
Can you speak up for the stream?
He had his first experience when he was 12. We were going to address that later, but do you want to talk about it now?
I mean, as far as cultural relevance goes, I mean, Maria Sabina, the person that brought psychoactive mushrooms to the country, was consuming psychoactive mushrooms when she was 6 years old. And that's something that's regularly done. I don't know what's an area where they're from in Mexico. Do you know? Oaxaca. It's something that's regularly done there. They're not illegal per se in that area, but it's not politic because it's part of the culture there. And children consume these substances.
I think what Reishi and we had all been discussing prior to this was talking about the normalization around trying to introduce this at a younger age so that it didn't seem so strange to people. And I think that's what you're trying to touch on a little bit. But I think that if we can bring more, or if we shed more light on these substances at a younger age. I remember my parents when I was little, they were like, not so little, but in high school, they're like, all right, if someone offers you drugs, like take half, wait 30 minutes, see how you feel, then like if you like it, take the other half. And I remember being like, I remember being like, okay, that sounds like chill, like, you know, and then I had friends where they would go off and like their parents were way more strict. and they just go off the wall. And it's like, you know, and it's that connection with your parents where you're like, all right, well, maybe everything's bad. And like, if I'm in trouble, I can talk to you about it. But yeah, I kind of wanted to touch on that. I think we all did, because the development around, I don't know, healthy relationships with specific plants and fungi is so important.
We could probably touch on that a little bit later, and continue the thought on the cultural and historical. Just you can hit mute on whoever popped up, but just to I'll do it. But just to like finish that thought, I don't know if I'm gonna say like I think that children should be taking psychoactive substances, because I'm not in any place to say that. But I'm just saying that it's culturally been done. And I mean, those are the cultures that brought this to the Western world. So I think that there is relevance to that. But honestly, aside from what I've said, I don't know that much about the historical use of psychoactive fungi.
I mean, it's like interesting because that Life magazine article is essentially like, and I'll just say white man's introduction to those fungi, even though they've been around for forever, since we were evolving as humanoids.
Yeah.
So like, it's like obviously something.
I mean, in order to
stranger to me.
In order for it to get in order for it to become relevant in any civilized culture, it had to have been brought by a white man. It's like that's just the nature of things in our culture. I mean, now things are shifting, but for it to be brought here, that was the only way that it would have been like successfully
Harvard educated,
recognized.
Well, I think that's a testament to Michael Pollan's book. I feel like he's like way more digestible for people because they're like, oh, Michael Pollan. But if it was like William Padilla-Brown talks about psychedelics, like I don't know. Yeah,
talking about
be a little different.
Be like less.
But it's much more approachable to like hand that book to someone and be like,
or to your mom, or to your
right, exactly. And have him like on crazy talk shows,
like Oprah and stuff like that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That's okay. How did Maria Sabina bring it up to?
She did bring it up to
Andrew. So Andrew, I think is Andrew Gordon Wasson. He was a Harvard educator, right? Was it Harvard?
I can't remember.
Yeah, I think
or Oxford. He went down to Mexico and participated in a ceremony and documented the whole thing. And then came back, and then there was a Time article on it. It was a really big thing of cultural appropriation, and once the Time article came out, a lot of complications came up for people who are using that. There's like a lot of culture and history around that I don't know a lot, but there's a movie called The Little Saints. That's what Maria would refer to them as The Little Saints. And a lot of history around Maria. She's one of the most influential elders in the like teaching
modern history
of psychoactive fungi and so probably psychoactive substances in general. So Mexico is a really big hotspot for this knowledge, but then you also see it in other cultures. You see it in a lot of Indian and Ayurvedic history. It's a little more subtly hidden, but you see the cow god Shiva.
The stoma.
Shiva, the cow god?
Mm-hmm.
The blue one?
Oh, Krishna.
The blue
Nandi?
deity. Blue deity. But there's like cultural references to like mushrooms, cows. The cow is so sacred. These mushrooms, cubensis, growing off of cow dung. And then the god itself is like this bright blue. A lot of people know that Strauss speciations, Bruce blue. And question, Mari.
Well, this whole conversation is kind of stirring my head into like a cauldron that says like, well, I'm thinking about like the history of Amanita use in Siberia,
Totally.
Which a lot of those people were probably quite like losing melanin due to where they were geographically. And then I'm also thinking about the endemic mushrooms here in the Northwest. So wondering about perhaps if like some of the natives in this region ever, perhaps not as recorded as other instances and like contacts, but it's kind of bringing up in my head that perhaps the whole origin is quite mixed. You know,
Very,
culturally.
very mixed. And we didn't take a picture of it. I wish we had. But
We have the Amanita somewhere.
We have the Amanita on the coast when you're driving to this place called Port Stevens, which is notorious for picking at Slosby Azarescens. There's a statue of Chief Astoria, and Chief Astoria's hat is the exact shape of the cap of an Azzy. And you look at that, and it's really hard to believe that they weren't in full knowledge of that mushroom and actually holding that mushroom as sacred and being like the chief, the headdress the chief is wearing is an Azarescen mushroom cap. And then, like you said, Siberia, I mean, the pagan culture in Siberia, there was a huge, deep, rich history of usage of Amanita muscaria in Siberia with shamans, and even the origin of, the story of Christmas.
Soma.
Soma.
Is that Tibetan or Indian?
Well, actually, Soba is. Sorry, I'm writing a book on this. So
Yeah.
this is like everybody's sort of looking at me because I know this,
You
but
should be up here.
yeah. So Amanita muscaria was actually traditionally used by the Sami people. And the Sami people are Finland, Norway,
Mhm.
Denmark, Sweden, and Siberia.
Mhm.
And since they're indigenous peoples, they're not really given their own land, but it's actually traditional for women to harvest the Amanita muscaria and sun dry them, and they actually sprinkle it and put it in the soups and the food of people to keep their consciousness open. But yeah, Siberian shamans in the Siberia side, the Russian side, the Samis wear red dress. That's their traditional dress. Whereas like in Sweden, for example, they're blue.
Yeah.
So they kind of know
Love
from
it.
their dress. But Siberian shamans wear red, black boots,
Black boots,
white fur.
white fur.
They use a special bag to collect the Amanita muscaria. They do a ceremony where they crawl in where the spirit comes out and in, which is the smokehouse.
Yeah.
Chimney, right? And then so the shaman comes in with a bag over his shoulder with his red and his black boots, and then he hands out, right?
Yeah, and then they dry them over the fire,
Yeah.
like the stockings, and then even just like the present under the tree, you see the red, white mushroom popping up under the fir tree.
And the
Exactly.
fly reindeer.
Well, and actually that goes back to your animals. So the reindeer are the ones that ate the
And they
Amanita
would
muscaria.
fly.
Right. Yeah.
A rude dog
And-
specifically had no
And
They
then
collect the urine.
Yeah, they would collect-
the name of your body.
Victory, yeah, and we haven't come up with, we have a working title, but really for me, I went to NCNM and I have a background in herbs, but also, so I want the science, but also the spirituality. And I'm interviewing First Nations and Native people in our area for more of their background.
Are you here, based in Seattle? Born and raised?
We'll limit the crowd talk for a little bit to continue.
Not that wasn't.
No, that was
great.
pretty
Yeah.
good.
Thank you, Victory.
But yeah, there is
Happy
also like
for that.
historic documentation of peoples feeding Amanita to animals and then utilizing the urine after it's been passed through. But one thing I'd like to know before we move on to the other section is that around the time whenever the Time magazine was posted in the United States, psychoactive substances weren't illegal in the United States yet. So there was a brief period of time that mushrooms and LSD, which had just been brought to the United States, were being utilized by universities for research in psychoactive therapies. So there was a period where some of our parents or grandparents lived through a time where psychoactive substances weren't illegal, but they weren't well known, and people were utilizing them in who knows what kind of fashion. And a lot of instances prior to the criminalization of these substances and directly after the criminalization of these substances, people were taking massive amounts of these, which we would consider like ultra mega doses at this point. Like the amounts that were used in the 60s and 70s were way higher than what we're considering like to be a large amount right now.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good
years.
transition.
Yeah.
I just have one more point. There would be a lot more cultural knowledge. I've done a lot of traveling in Central America and South America, and a lot of the indigenous down there, they don't have memory of usage of fungi, and that's some of the most diverse fungal areas down there. And we can thank the Catholic Church for that, because the Inquisition went in literally beat that knowledge out of the indigenous cultures. And so a lot of it's been lost. There are areas where it is preserved, but we have lost a lot of it.
Yeah, and I mean not just the Catholic Church, but settler and colonial culture in
Yeah.
general, and up until like 1954, like in Canada, being like creative languages, and yeah, not Catholic Church, but like settler culture displacing the First Nations people and making their cultural practices, their language, passing on information, like literally not legal and allowed to practice. So yeah, that's important to recognize, especially as we do now like engage in a lot of the practices and discussions that First Nations people were penalized for their existence.
I know in the Fantastic Fungi movie, they had the stones, the small stones with they had the head, with a mushroom head.
Yeah, we
So
just
there's
saw
still
those.
right there.
Yeah, we got to see those this week.
Wow.
The collection's growing, and eventually they're going to be brought back down to where they originated. We should save questions for the end because we are kind of using up a lot of.
Yeah, but so yeah, that's kind of a good segue into next. We want to talk about just like the history of psychoactive psychedelics and psychoactive fungi in the U.S. and the war on drugs, the war on consciousness, and its current legal status. And yeah, as Will was talking about, kind of like psychoactive medicines and substances being really like a core cultural practice in many cultures, including our own, until kind of the 60s and 70s, where Woodstock happened and like mass cultural transformation and revolution, and especially at the same time as the Vietnam War, and we started having this really aggressive foreign policy, and then people were taking massive amounts of psychedelics, and we're like, I don't want to go kill somebody I've never met before. And the rise of the pacifist movement and countercultural movements as being really tied to psychoactive medicines, and then Nixon and like wanting to like not promote pacifism and anti-war efforts is then came really down hard. Yeah, like Nixon, like all the war on drugs happened during that time, and Nixon like scheduled psychedelics as like controlled substances, classified one at the same level as like meth and heroin and like all this ridiculous stuff. And so it's kind of in that like crazy controlled like anti-revolution fury that like our drug laws were born, and they still apply today. So yeah, in terms of like, maybe does someone want to talk about the current legal status and what to be careful about when you're wild harvesting?
Well, at least in Washington State, if it's growing naturally in your yard, that's not illegal. It's this legality that comes in where you pick it, and then it becomes illegal. It's still, I think still Schedule 1.
Yeah, it is.
Schedule 1 substance,
Not
and
in
it's still
Denver.
considered poison. The charge of selling it is manslaughter because it's considered a poison, which is just really crazy that science doesn't catch up with law of like, it's not poison, you're not killing someone, but they don't care. It was made a law that way, and it's going to be really hard to change that for a little bit. I mean, distribution and growing is totally illegal. People go to jail for that. Not, as far as I've heard, not like super, not prison, but you're definitely like freedom for some years. Can't decide necessarily what you want to do. There has been all these movements, the decriminalized movements, in Colorado, and specifically Denver, and Oregon, and California, and Oakland, in Chicago, where they've decriminalized it, where if you're just using it as a citizen, you're not going to get a case. Yeah.
But it's still illegal to grow it.
Grow and to sell it.
Yeah. So maybe you want to talk about the difference between legalization.
Well, we see decriminalization a lot with cannabis. In Philadelphia, cannabis is decriminalized, and people host parties and do all these like fundraisers for nonprofits and things like that. You're not allowed to sell it, you're not allowed to cultivate it, but you can consume it. But even though you can technically consume it, you can still get a fine for it. Just because it's decriminalized doesn't mean it's legal. If you get caught with cannabis, you get a fine, but it's not like you're gonna go to jail.
Or like a felony, controlled substances.
So, I mean, it's really interesting to see how it's been done in these states so far, which I think is a great step forward, because decriminalization was the great step forward for cannabis legalization. But I'd like to kick it over to Europe for a moment. When we all think about substance use, we mostly think about Amsterdam when we think about Europe. And Amsterdam is really interesting in the fact that psychoactive mushrooms weren't illegal for a very long time. I think it wasn't until like the early 2000s or the 90s, whenever they made psychedelic mushrooms illegal, but they didn't write in that psychedelic truffles were illegal, which is different in the US because it's psilocybin containing fungus, so to speak. So like anything that contains psilocybin is going to be illegal, which is interesting because Massapora is not illegal yet, but I don't know, maybe we can talk about that later. It's the fungus that infects cicada.
Yeah, go ahead
and
talk about
well, if anybody hasn't heard about it, there's a fungus that infects cicada and it rots their butt off, and it disperses their spores through the little butt part, and it produces psilocybin, but it also produces amphetamine, and it produces amphetamine because a bug with its butt rotted off is not going to want to fly around. It's probably going to feel lethargic, so it produces this amphetamine that makes the bug fly around, and it disperses these spores. But it also produces a psilocybin, but we don't know why it produces a psilocybin, and it makes males mate with males, and it makes females mate with females so they can get on each other and spread these spores, which is interesting. Massapora is not illegal, and you can go culture it and find a cicada on the East Coast that has its butt falling off that has psilocybin in it, and it can be cultured and probably grown out, which is also interesting because we have the research out of England, I believe, right now with the genetically engineered bacteria that's producing 3 grams of psilocybin per liter of liquid culture.
E. coli species.
So I mean, there is all these weird like niche things that are happening as far as like legality goes. I mean, we have Johns Hopkins University just opened the largest psychedelic research center in the world.
And it's becoming more common. I spoke with someone on the phone recently, and he was talking to me about mushrooms and mushroom medicine and whatnot. Next thing you know, he's like, "Well, my dad's actually a part of the panel at Johns Hopkins," and I'm like sitting there like, what? Like I hear about this all the time, but for you to tell me, and you know, he's close by to where we live in Pennsylvania, so it's interesting how rapidly, and they do have them on placebo, and then the other half on psychedelics. So, anyways, but it's interesting to see how close the worlds are colliding.
Cool. Y'all want to talk about how to identify our local species of philosophy?
Well, there's a really amazing book that you have there. That's my favorite book for this. But psilocybin mushrooms of the world. It's a field guide for psilocybin mushrooms.
It's got great history in it too.
Yeah.
Really nice.
And there's like at least 3 different main types, or maybe even 4 main types of psilocybe that grow here in different
you guys
ecology.
are lucky.
Yeah.
We got 1.
Yeah. So like
we have 2.
We have Psilocybe ovoideo-cystidiata, and we have this one really, really tiny one that we found in New York that almost is like smaller than Mycena.
Is it like folliculosa?
I can't remember what it's called. We found it at the New Moon Mycology Summit. It was really tiny under the bush.
Yeah.
But we have the Psilocybe ovoideo-cystidiata, which is one of the only ones we have, and it's another one of those wood-loving, especially loves wood chips, which I think is interesting because it follows the path of human destruction, because there's not often that wood chips exist in nature. So it's like, oh, you guys are being destructive. Here's this thing that might calm you down a little bit. You guys are like, chill out. And we find them usually around universities and like courthouses, police stations, parks, and things like that. So
where
it's
people
very
will
symbolic.
find them.
But I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh no, that's perfect.
I don't know anything about the philosophy of the
Well, I know that we were just discussing psilocybe azarescens, now famous from Michael Collins' book, because I know he's also blasting those all over the place.
The spots
And
too.
the spots too.
Everybody the spots.
But so the spots are getting a little bit like, I've just like one brief thing I want to mention, which I think we're gonna go a little bit into, but the ecology is really small, or the ecosystem we're talking about is really tiny, and they don't really go very far away from this environment, this specific mushroom. So it seems with a lot of people are going there. That's great. It's just, I think, like habitat destruction that becomes sort of an issue, and people are just tromping all of this beautiful state park, for example, just to go back there tomorrow and do it again. And it's like, a lot of this is super special and magical to have. So like, respect that. But that's I feel like a fairly small area. They were discovered by a Boy Scout troop that was doing a camping trip there and we're doing some mushroom ID and end up finding them, which is also a funny little side note.
So funny.
You also have the psilocybe cyanescens that's growing in wood chips, again, like the ovoid types. With human destruction comes more psilocybe cyanescens. And then
Premier
you get
species.
some Alenciata out here too, correct?
And we get Lenii.
Yeah.
We get Ovoideus cystidiata. In the spring, yeah.
And then you got like Stunzia.
We got Stunzia, we got Folliculosa.
And do you have any Paniolas here?
We do.
Yeah. So there's multiple genus besides psilocybe that produces psilocybin. In the East Coast, we also have Gymnopolis that produces psilocybin at negligible amounts.
But they taste bad.
They taste gross. People call them big laughing gyms. They're big, kind of orangey yellow mushrooms.
They're cubensis
What
that
does
are
it mean?
naturalized here.
Oh, nice.
All of them.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
That's a small portion of all the species.
That's a lot.
the Wiley Eye grows down in Georgia, and it's one of these like landslide type mushrooms that happens a lot more where people like are again just being destructive, or more towards like on mountains and things like that. And another little interesting tidbit fact is that a lot of these psilocybe type mushrooms, their types were sent to Gaston Guzman. No, is that something?
Guzman,
Yeah. He was the one that was identifying all of them. And so a lot of them were sent in multiple times and had like minute differences or microscopic differences and were identified and classified differently. So we have a lot of psilocybe genus mushrooms that have different names as the same mushroom. We were just talking to Paul like 2 days ago, and he was telling me that what's the dude with the big beard? Richard Gaines. Him and Richard Gaines.
Yeah.
Remember, I was like, what's his last name?
Richard Gaines and Paul Stamets both wrote a paper on identifying psilocybe ovoideo cystidiata as psilocybe vernalis, which means the spring psilocybe because it grows in the spring. But Guzman ended up calling it ovoideo cystidiata, and who's going to repeat? Who's going to be able to say that? You know what I mean? Like, but I mean, I'm a nerd though. There's no, that's what we call them ovoids.
Well, and like interesting side notes. I mean, like in Colorado, even that ecology doesn't really have as many because it's not as moist. But people look for them and find them, and some of them are new. I don't think that. Like a lot of it is too the times that it's supposed to be like the fruit is like the edge of winter. It's like usually fall. There is the spring one.
We get them in the spring.
Yeah, but I feel like it's like cooler weather, cooler rainy weather. That a lot of people aren't out as much mushroom hunting in a way too. A lot of the porcini are done, the chanterelles are kind of ending. Like everything's kind of turning off, and that's kind of the time for those to be coming around. And I feel like that's a lot of why we don't even know how many species there are. There's new ones discovered every year that are active species. And then like you were saying, there's also how many different types of fungi where we're finding psilocybin in them. Either, like Pluteus, we found them in.
Yep.
Yeah, like Canosabe.
Inosabe too.
Or Inosabe too, yeah. So I mean, I think that there's a lot more mushrooms that contain it than we know.
Oh yeah.
If you are interested in furthering your studies as far as psilocybe species, Alan Rockefeller is probably the world's best resource at this point.
Yeah.
He's in a unique position where he doesn't work for a university or doesn't work for anybody that might take his job away for studying psilocybe. So he usually spends like 6 months out of the year in Mexico discovering new psilocybe species.
Yeah.
So he's probably the world's expert on psilocybe.
He's a funny guy.
Yeah.
And there's a really great podcast that just came out on him.
Yeah.
Shout out, Alan. Yeah.
Awesome.
We'll save questions for the end. We are kind of.
Yeah. So next, it'd be sweet to talk about like what current research has been finding about psilocybin's potentials for healing, especially around end of life care, PTSD, neurogenesis.
Maybe you want to. Well,
I don't know anything. I was just
There's
in the movie.
Hefters.
I was just in the movie.
Hefter Institute comes down to tell you that often, and they do a lot of clinical stuff with psilocybin. Mostly, like we were saying, with people with post-traumatic stress syndrome, etc. And I know they've done several phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, which is really amazing. We've got a bunch more coming up. And so we've also have John Hopkins that did a bunch of, like they're building a new laboratory. You have MAPS that does tons and tons and tons of funding for that stuff.
Yeah.
And, you know, they have their facilities too. They do a lot of research there.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, everyone from MAPS is so amazing. So,
yeah, and physiologically speaking, like what it does to our brains and like the evolution potential and what Will was talking about a bit at the beginning is it literally increases the capacity of like our brain to form novel new neural connections and have neurons in different parts of our brain that usually don't communicate and share information with each other, share information. And we also get this floodgate of information that our body usually filters out for survival. Like if anyone's read The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, it's the book that gave the band The Doors their name. It talks about using psychoactive substances and how like normally our sensory perceptions perceive like a lot or are capable of perceiving a lot of information, but then when it gets filtered through the brain so we can actually like focus on survival, like a lot of that information gets filtered out, because if we were just like in like processing everything that life was sending at us at every given moment, especially in like a city where there's like constantly so many things, you just like numb things out or shut things out just subconsciously and consciously. And so when you take psilocybin and psychoactive medicine, these floodgates, these doors of perception are like flung wide open, and you get all of this information, all of this sensory processing that normally you're not clued into, and it comes in, and that's why colors are more vivid. Like you can like hear sounds and like feel textures and all this cross communication of the brain and like neurogenesis. So when I think of psilocybin, like the main word I associate with it is like evolution, like neurological evolution, cross connection. So it can have really amazing effects on our brain, particularly people with concussions, with migraines. Like there's a lot of good cluster headaches, particularly because it also increases blood flow. It's a neurovasodilator, so it increases blood flow to your brain. And a lot of neurological issues can actually be healed and solved with macro and or micro doses of psilocybin. And just like neurological evolution. And because of that cross wiring and the ability to like develop new perspective, it can be really helpful for end of life care for people who like couldn't even imagine what not being alive would be like, and then to like really like feel death and imagine a new way of existing. And also folks with PTSD or any sort of trauma, being able to like revisit that and rewire their relationship to it. There's also a lot of really great studies and movements with MDMA and healing trauma. But yeah, so just in like when I think of the potential healing applications of psilocybin, those are like kind of the main areas that I go to. Welcome, happy you're here.
I'd love to add something in from my own experiences, not from anything that's like scientifically researched or anything, which was where a lot of our information came, was pre-scientific research. But when I was younger and going through all my psychoactive experiences, I considered myself an urban shaman, which a lot of people might find like, you can't just say you're a shaman or da-da-da-da, but a lot of the shamanistic cultures are kind of dying out. And it's not something we want to see happen, but I was never traditionally trained. But in my experiences, I saw that I was capable of aiding people through bad experiences or confusing experiences and things of that nature. And one of the things that I found out, I had the luxury of a good education, and my parents loved me, and I was able to raise up through levels of experience of life as I grew up. And there's a lot of people that are born into situations where they're not, maybe they're not well taken care of, maybe there's not always food, or maybe their relationships with their family are not great, and they usually live in this like baseline experience as they grow up, where like, I just need to survive. Like there's a lot of crazy stuff going on around me. My parents are fighting. Like, I don't know if there's gonna be dinner on the table. And when I lived in Pennsylvania, I lived around a lot of people that grew up in these experiences where they didn't have access to good education. They didn't have a really loving and helping family. They're on all sorts of government help, and they don't have access to food and these things. And I noticed when I had psychoactive experiences with people that have that kind of background versus people that are well off and the families took care of them and they went to great schools and they know a lot, the experiences are entirely different. We're having these experiences where like the people that come from the background where it's not so great and they're living in these like lower level like chakras, so to speak, or these base survival experiences are like, wow, like my stomach is hurting because I ate these Twinkies, or like maybe eating all these junk food is not good for me, or like, wow, my mom was mad at me. And I'm like, you didn't notice that already? That's not something that you're like regular, like in a normal sober state, that's not something that you're aware of. And I feel like a lot of the healing comes from slowly becoming more aware of your surroundings. We have to realize that we're surrounded by a lot of times I'll be in situations where everybody was well taken care of. Everybody had a pretty nice childhood and a pretty nice upbringing, and they don't have to worry about those kinds of things. But I feel like a lot of like the healing and I feel like that's something that should have some sort of focus on its research. Like a lot of the children that have gone through the system, that have been through foster care, that have had these crazy upbringings, like this medicine can be, trauma. This medicine can be very, very beneficial to like bringing them to like some sort of homeostasis for the first time in their lives, where they're like, wow, like I am a person. I have this body. This body is affected by X, Y, and Z. Like I have emotions. They're legitimate to me. You know what I mean? Like I'm not whatever my parents said I was, or I'm not whatever society says I was. And like I've personally guided people through those experiences and helped to bring them to some sort of level of homeostasis for the first time in their lives. And a lot of people came to me and they asked me like, how do you have those experiences? Like, how do you get to that point where you're actually learning things from this? And I'm just like, well, first of all, you don't want to do it while you're watching movies or in a loud party or something like that. And so like, I think that a lot of research should move, especially if we're going towards like decriminalization and legalization, where these things are going to be available to people, should be more moving towards like safety and responsible use. And that's something that definitely needs like that scientific backing that makes more people like, oh, that's legitimate. Like because some university research it now, that's okay to
but I think that's why it's so important that so many universities are studying all this now. And Michael Pollan's writing books. You know, though
it's becoming accessible.
And it makes things feel less,
people trust it.
Stigma.
But I love and super resonated what you just shared, Will, and I would love to, just kind of fractal off from that a little bit more and vision, like, and discuss just what the best kind of containers are for respectfully using psilocybin and what it's, how to fully access its healing potential and what kind of containers we can create as individuals and as communities to hold those kinds of experiences.
Like respectful use of the thing.
That's my seamless transition.
Will has like also like, I don't know if you want to transition into like your thoughts on like when things are to become legalized, how you feel like it should be facilitated.
First maybe let's talk about like what we can do, like, and then move on to what like the legalization process and the potential flaws with that.
I think this is a great place to start. I think hosting safe spaces for people to communicate. Like we're not doing anything wrong right now. Like talking about things
this is illegal.
There's nothing illegal about communication.
We're live streaming.
But like also in the places that it is decriminalized, I mean like finding access. I mean I know that there's like cafes opening up making coffee. Like it's becoming so like trendy and
very trendy.
But like I don't know, that kind of is like, I don't think any random Joe should be able to go get a cup of Joe with some psilocybin in it, because it might throw them for a loop, you know, like not everybody's ready for it.
Colorado did a lot with marijuana when we legalized it, you know. There was a lot of like safety pamphlets and public service that Colorado, I feel, did an amazing job.
It's interesting to hear your perspective, because I didn't even know that any of that was going on.
Like they have commercials on TV that say like, hey, if you're to use this, be careful when driving. Like they give you all of it. It's a cute cartoon and it's great for kids even to watch it. Where it's like informative and informational and how it should be. I mean, it's like, hey, like be an adult. You're an adult to make your own decisions. However, like if you're gonna go make your own decisions, did you think about, since this is your very first time, like, hey, maybe you shouldn't eat a bunch of them and go driving. Maybe you should, like having regulations. And I think it's really easy when you look at the marijuana industry. Like this translates so easily. It really does. Like all the same things, like having a dispensary where you need to be ID, you need to, we have different kinds, and how they were, how they were grown, they were dried correctly. You have to have like legal standards of like at least some sort. And what are those standards? And I think these first states to decriminalize it. Obviously, the next steps are already to legalize it. And they want to work on, like those pieces essentially have to be left in these bills for legislators to be able to have some say on what's going on here. I mean, one of the things we talked a lot about when we were crafting the bill for legalization of marijuana was, well, you can't just like disenfranchise ourselves from all these different communities. Like when you look at like a state, you have so many different people living there. You have people, sure, that want to legalize weed. You also have a lot of people that don't. But the thing is, it's about like educating people that don't. It's like, look, like this is not going to get into the hands of your children. It's not going to, but also you have to think about like law enforcement, like, DUIs. Things of that nature, like, like leaving some, like some room for legislators is really important, I think, to get everyone on the same page and doing this. Like, because they're going to have to craft like all of this stuff for us to be able to use it recreationally, let's say, which I think is really the push at some point, is to also not just use these as therapeutic things, but also, like you were saying, like just for your own mental health and stability, like, or like, like I call it like leveling up, but like, like slowly building on the last times and like becoming better. And I see it as like almost like a segue to like, I feel like for my own experiences, I can look at myself finally in the third person, where it's like I'm looking at me and the decisions that I make and the things that I say and the things that I say to my friends and like how they're feeling about that and like how they're responding to me. And sometimes my intention is not what my outward body is doing. I'm not sending the messages that I want to send to my friends of like love and compassion. So like that for me on like my path has really like helped me just for that, like looking at what I do and not get stuck in these cyclical, or just even there's pressures from society. You think you want to do things because somebody told you wanted to. It's like, did you really ever stop to think about it and make a decision and be like, no, wait, why was I doing that? Like, why was I smoking cigarettes? You know what I mean? Like, and quitting smoking, like psilocybin helps me with all of those things. Like when I could barely take it and I'm like, I need something to like tell me this is okay and I'm doing the right thing, and that's what psilocybin does. Is it's just like, hey, this is you're gonna make it. You're gonna make it through it. So
kind of like flowing off like what can we do? I think the whole, if anybody's seen any Fantastic Fungi or anybody's read any of the like research coming out of Johns Hopkins, we're seeing psychologists sit and watch people trip and they're completely sober and have never taken a psychoactive substance on record ever. Where in like traditional cultures, we see people give somebody a psychoactive substance and they're tripping too the whole time while they're guiding somebody through it. And through my experience of like whatever I called urban shamanism, I was always under the influence of the substance while helping somebody that was under the influence of the substance. And I think we need to see a rise of some kind of urban shamanistic culture. Maybe an urban shaman is not the best name for them. Maybe something else arises of it. Yeah, maybe it's like appropriation, but like there needs to be something of that nature, because like we're destroying the rainforest where these people exist. There's not many traditional shamans anymore. Like the shamans aren't passing on the cultures anymore to their young anymore.
Well, they are passing it on. It's just a lot of the young now are going to the cities. I mean, you even see it in the Amazon communities. I actually got to spend some time in Ecuadorian Amazon with a couple of different tribes. One, the Warani, which have no psychoactive substance that they use, which is always really surprising for a lot of people to hear that there's an Amazonian tribe that doesn't have ayahuasca, DMT analog. And then the Kofan people, which have their ayahuasca ceremonies very regularly. Yeah, there's the knowledge is being passed on, but it's hard because there's a lot of trauma. A lot of people are leaving the communities for modernity, and it's a sad thing to see. But there's being down there. There's a lot of people in those communities who are carrying on those traditions and want to keep doing it. You know, they're stepping up into the roles of their fathers and their mothers and their grandparents, and they're really pushing it forward. And it's a really beautiful thing to see down there, and to see in lots of different parts of the world, people keeping these things alive, even though it has been very intentionally tried to like beat out of people, because the knowledge that we're given from these psychoactive substances is not a knowledge that your government wants you to have. They don't want you thinking like a fully aware human being who
Questioning
questions
authority.
That's why there's been a war on drugs.
Or recognizes your own sovereigns.
Or recognize
Like
your
your
own
sovereignty.
sovereignty.
Yeah.
We were driving to the airport the other day, and there was some guy on like a hang glider, and we were just like, that guy's fully on a hang glider. He's gonna die, and that's fully legal.
That's fully legal.
Like, we were literally staring at it, we're like, that's crazy. Like, it's cloudy.
Drinking
like,
alcohol is
legal.
I can go pick and eat mushrooms.
On a hang
that
glider
can kill
also
me.
valid.
Yeah, like
I can eat
Yeah.
mushroom. I can pick and eat mushrooms that will kill me, but not. Sounds like
Yeah.
Well, as far
that's
as,
an
like-
interesting point.
Well,
Yeah.
as far as like
Picking
safety,
deathly mushrooms.
because we're talking about like also just like integrating like these things for like even people like creating spaces, I think too. Like we're talking about creating containers.
spaces. Like, how can we
Like how do you create this container, but also like it's important to, when you have these experiences, be in a place that is like a safe place that people are gonna, like, if you feel uncomfortable, they're gonna help you. They're gonna wanna like, you're not like around a bunch of people you don't know at some, you know, concert.
University or
Yeah,
something.
like, you know,
Yeah,
like, I
there's
feel like-
someone there who you trust. Like I find that having like one relationship around that I trust, I feel cared by them, and I can just trip balls and like be authentic and like just trust that they're not judging me. Like having that there, and then once you have had enough of those experiences and develop a relationship with the fungus, then like having these experiences even by yourself and in nature, where like it's just like fully you and nature, and you can like dissolve your ego and your humanness. Like those experiences, I feel like the deepest I've gone with mushrooms is when I'm like alone, like deep in the forest, like don't even need to interact with the human realm, but that's after I've like cultivated a deep relationship and trust myself in that space. So up until that space, finding safe spaces with someone around that you trust. Taking psychedelics with new friends like always seems like a good idea of like, oh yeah, like let's bond. And it's like always weird. It can go weird pretty quickly. And so like back to what Will was talking about is this dynamic that like, you know, John Hopkins is doing with like bringing people into like a windowless room in like
Inside
a
of a
hospital
university.
with somebody who's like observing you and like super academic, and it's like this power dynamic that like a lot of institutionalized anything have, and that creates whenever there's a power dynamic, especially that's aggravated when like you're tripping balls and super vulnerable and I'm like powerful and sober, and it's like
poking you.
and there's already
I mean, they're like holding their hands and playing nice music, but like honestly, like the last place I'd want to be when I'm tripping is in like some system.
and
I also
someone like
feel like-
watching me the whole time, like
I
whoa,
feel like
that's
too,
crazy.
like I agree with the sentiment, but I also think that like there's a level of like validating this for like what we need to
Yeah, it's
validate
totally
it for,
necessary.
obviously, and like the only way, like you said, to be able to do it is that way. But also having met people like Mary who like do this and are practitioners, like they've helped these people have the most incredible and amazing experiences in those
Kind of
settings.
also
Where I'm
spiritual
like,
experience
like
in their
obviously, like there's better settings.
Kind
You know
of
what I
also
mean?
to play up what you're saying, Graham, though, like some people that are of different ages and have such a stigma around these things need a setting of like, okay, this is safe, this is prescribed,
There's
this
a
is a
doctor, he's
doctor,
here,
yeah.
they're here.
You know, and if it's working, then it's working great.
Yeah, I mean, it is working. I'm just saying.
Yeah, it's not
I
an
feel
issue.
you. I feel you. And like,
Yeah.
that's definitely like a large piece of what people have to talk about.
Yeah.
You know,
Like
it's that it's like it's very like laboratory coat.
You think about like your grandma. I mean,
Yeah, but that's what I think of
yeah,
too.
yeah.
It's like I had like my grandfather, and I love him a lot. He's like, what are the things he gets his community from in his church?
Totally.
You know what I mean? That's not where I get my community.
Totally.
But I also don't talk down to it because it does so much. It enriches his life.
Yeah,
I
just
it
think
really does. And like same thing with all of this. I think is like it depends on where you're at. Your setting can be maybe you need that. Like to not even talk down to that. Maybe that's what you need.
Maybe church is
to go feel comfortable, right?
Yeah.
Whereas like maybe
That's
it's
true.
actually just around family, or it's just with one good close friend.
Although-
It's
Like,
like,
I
yeah,
think that the ground base level though of a lot of this is just having conversations with your everyday people around you. Because I feel like that brings, like, I think that this is really weird, but whenever, even when I was younger and even with adults that I'm friends with now, I never have ever lied about anything. Like where, around drugs, where it's like, no, it's like if I wanted to, like, if I was at a friend's house and I wanted to go smoke a joint, I'd be like, I'm gonna go smoke a joint. And make it blatantly obvious. Even if the parents were weirded out by it, it was the normal conversation to have. I remember being in a room with my grandmother, so straight edge, like goes to church every week, amazing woman. But her and my mom were at my apartment in New York, and we had just had dinner and drinks, and we got back to my apartment, and I blatantly started rolling up a joint and passed it to her after I lit it and hit it. And she just like didn't even think about it. She's like, oh, this must be normal. And she smoked weed with me, and like never in her life has she ever smoked weed. She's like, how am I supposed to? I'm like, you inhale it, And I'm like talking to her, and she smokes it.
normally.
And she woke up the next morning, and she was like, that was pleasant, And like it felt safe. And I think that that's
I
kind of
don't think I'm going to hell today.
yeah. She was like, that was pleasant.
Cool.
And I'm like, that's great. Yeah.
5 more minutes
Okay.
before opening the question.
well, I think to even segue into the microdosing, which even kind of goes out of safety and integration, but dosing I think is also really important. I'm like starting small if it's your first time, because I feel like some
And
people
stacking.
and stacking and
Like a
getting
gram,
comfortable,
then 2
be
grams,
comfortable.
then
Don't
a
like you don't have to just dive headfirst into something, you know what I mean? Like people do
Transfer
it. and
pen is
then-
cool, but don't.
Yeah.
Not all.
You don't do that for your first time. You know what I mean? Like
Take
that
the
doesn't
road
have to be
dose.
that way. And I think also just really fast before we change subject, just like headset. So like I like set and setting just as like I don't know who said that, but set and setting is really important. I feel like your headset for sure. Like where are you at right now? Or if you had the worst week ever and like that might be the greatest thing ever, but also like you know what I mean? Like really, I like to do a lot of like thinking and like meditation even, or just like like being with myself, listening to myself, and like asking myself if that's what I feel like I need, instead of just like diving head first into things, because sometimes that can make that have fun.
Yeah, and setting an intention, I find psilocybin responds really powerfully to intention, because you're literally like directing the growth of your brain and neurogenesis.
It's
so
all
if you
you.
have
It's all you.
It's all you.
but having an intention and having that to come back to when you're tripping balls and you're like, what am I and why am I here and what's going on? And then you're like, okay, like my intention is to like evolve or to grow or to like learn about nature, like whatever your intention is. That's kind of like your lifeboat in this like ocean of mystery.
Yeah, I have just like a couple things. I mean, if we're gonna be switching into questions, we're not gonna be able to do the rest of the stuff. But I mean, I agree with you both. I believe that you're totally in control of it, and like you have to realize that there is like you are your experience. Like that anxiety is you, that depression is you, and it's all in you. It's all in your head. I've only ever had one bad trip, and it lasted like 5 minutes before I told it to stop, and then it turned into the most beautiful experience in my life. But
But you can tell it. You can be like, okay, like chill out. This is hard for me. Like stop. And let
there are people that are capable of having that mental control over themselves and that emotional control over themselves, and there are people that aren't. I've had one person very, very close to me try to commit suicide off of psychoactive substances. I had another person very close to me that walked outside of a window while using psychedelic substances. And I think that as we enter into this realm of like legalization, decriminalization, and things of that nature, we have to understand that there are people that are in a mental state unstable. There's a lot of unstable people that could just go to a store and buy alcohol right now. And if it was like the way that cannabis is and you're over 18, could go into a store and buy cannabis. And like, I think when we get into these realms of these more powerful psychoactive substances, it's important for some level of prescription, maybe. I don't know if that's the best word, and I know that it's a plant and it should be free for everybody that can go find it to go get it. But like in our culture and the way that everything is set up and all the things that we've had blasted into our faces as we've grown up, there's all this opportunity for mental instability. And I think that we must have like some sort of like psychoanalyzation for people to take these substances, because some people, if they're in the wrong place, and if this is set up for this to happen with legalization in a similar fashion to cannabis, where somebody can just go take it, not know anything about it, be in a really weird place, and take it and have a potentially really bad experience that could demonize this for potential possibilities in the future,
Or make them unsafe.
or make them unsafe and potentially hurt somebody. Like if it wasn't for people grabbing this person from the front of a train, they would have been dead because of the psychoactive experience. So like there's all these possibilities for it to be incredibly beautiful, and there are possibilities for it to become demonized. And I think that we need to take the proper precautions, whether it becomes legal in your state and there is no prescription, that we hold spaces for education to make sure that there is some level of knowledge of the potential effects of these substances. And it's great to be all beautiful rainbows spewing out of your eyeballs and running around saying that this is the best thing ever, but also to have that responsibility and understand that if you are running around saying that this is the best thing ever, to know that there are potentials for somebody that maybe has schizophrenia or maybe has something else that might potentially not have the same experience that you did.
Well, you could develop a system like skydiving, where the first time you go skydiving, you have to be in tandem with someone. Maybe the first 2 or 3 times you do, but then eventually you get to the point where you can free dive yourself. And once you start to develop a literacy with this, then maybe it's opened up beyond the prescription side of things, you know.
Well,
Like you said.
Well, I think we demonize it too. Like we demonize the thing that's causing it instead of like looking at the people that took the substance. You know what I mean? Like alcohol. How many people today killed themselves drinking alcohol and doing something stupid? You know what I mean? Like for real. And so, like, I think it's also important to note, like, that's the potential for anything. Drinking a cup of coffee and getting too excited. I mean, like,
for sure.
I don't know, but like, you know what I mean? Like, that's gonna affect your decision making. Like, to blame the cup of coffee or the joint they smoked, I'm like, I don't know. I feel like a lot of that comes back on us culturally, if not like dealing with that as a culture and communicating these things to people and like warning people about like the potential risks and hazards of doing these things.
I also think people get tripped up in dose amounts for anything. Like even in rap songs, they're like, "Oh, I just took a whole Xan." I'm sorry, but if I took a whole Xan, I would be like on the floor.
On the floor.
Just like passed out. Like that's not what I need. You know what I mean?
Well, and it's like everyone's body is different.
Yeah.
Like everyone's body is gonna metabolize things differently, and like
Yeah, I mean, I have to honestly admit that I've done that multiple times in my music. I commonly refer to that 700 microgram of LSD, which is not acceptable for everybody.
Not acceptable.
But like that's like, I mean, it's art,
But
it's music,
people
but
look
it's
up to
things.
you
Yeah,
and might think that that's okay, and I think that that's where things.
You're an influencer, Will.
Yeah, everybody's an influencer, but like I mean, just because people say that in their music, I mean, it's not like everybody's gonna go do it, but like, but people are influenced by those kinds of things.
People will.
There are.
You need to take some sort of responsibility.
And I think that like kind of flows well into dosage amounts and microdosing, and I feel like that's a really safe accessibility point for a lot of people who maybe, I mean, and who doesn't like struggle with anxiety and depression. And I think for people who are curious about psilocybin, but like maybe, you know, like mental status, like, are they ready for a, you know, 3.5 gram dose? I don't know, but experiencing with microdosing where it's like less of a like entheogenic psychoactive experience and more of like a nutrient for your brain to grow, I think is an area of like a lot of interest and potential, and that I know at least Cassandra and I have a lot of experience with. And like I've had people after sharing a microdose recipe with them of like reporting back like, wow, my like anxiety and depression and basically like disconnection from magic and like beauty of the world that like causes depression and anxiety and like disconnection.
Too,
Thought loops. Yeah, it's like that, like being like healed from microdosing psilocybin and still being able to like show up at your day job and like have a like business meeting and schedule your calendar, do the dishes and do like everything you normally need to do because you're like pretty much mostly sober, but just have this like little sparkle of like psilocybin magic in your field, and that being like so good for mood, so good for mental health. And yeah, I really feel like personally, like I feel like I would want some more training before being like an urban shaman, or even though that's like such a necessary role, it's just like I want to be able to adequately assess somebody's mental health to like know who's ready for those kind of doses. But in terms of microdosing, like I feel pretty comfortable with like encouraging everyone to at least just try that, like depending on SSRI medications. But like even if it doesn't work, it's like such a small amount, and the amount that I really like working with is a super small amount. I like working on like the limit of something that's like barely perceptible, and the amount that I find a lot of resonance with is 0.05 grams. So like half of a tenth of a gram, and like a normal dose is like
I
2
will
to 4
say I've
grams.
done 0.1 and 0.3 and 0.4, and on 3 and 4 you feel like so aggro, and 1 you feel mild like psychosis. Personally, if you're curious. Key point. Yeah.
I was always like curious why, whenever I first started, probably in like 2011, 2012, why everybody told me that 3.5 was a dose. Like they were like, "Oh, you're gonna take mushrooms? Like take 3.5."
Yeah,
I'm just like, okay.
Yeah,
That's actually
I would start with microdosing, like 0.05 grams, and then stack up to 0.5. See how you feel at 0.5, and see how you feel at like 1 gram if you are trying to move towards like a more macro level. But like I feel pretty content staying around like 0.05, 0.1. And then there's also this like what Paul Stamets raps about is the stacking formula, where you can actually use microdoses of psilocybin in combination with like a medicinal mushroom like lion's mane, which also increases nerve growth factor, neurogenesis, cognitive enhancement, cognitive function. So those two medicines together are like this like total rock star combination of like, you know, psilocybin directing like new like neural growth, and then lion's mane coming in to like, you know, make permanent those new neural connections, and like them being a really amazing combination to take microdoses of psilocybin and really high doses of lion's mane is like the best recipe for evolution that I personally have ever come across.
Best recipe for evolution.
We have,
yeah, you can quote me on that.
We have 10 minutes for questions.
Is what?
Evolution is God's intelligent design.
We have 10 minutes for questions. And I wanted to start with the only one question that's on the live stream. Any recommended material for learning about planning and integrating microdosing? Paul Stamets just released an app called MicroMe, which is great.
Cool.
It's a great resource, and it's also great for the greater culture because they're doing a lot of data harvesting to see how it's affecting a mass amount of people. So I think they have over 10,000 users right now, and the more they add, the more that we all know.
Yeah.
I will
so
say
it's a
though,
great resource.
if that's something that makes you uncomfortable, reporting you doing an illegal substance to an app. When I was coming to understand the way that my body functioned more, 19 and 18 and so forth, I would literally sit and write down every day, like what I was ingesting and how I was feeling towards that in different intervals. And that's something that has still been a really serious baseline in my life. So I would also encourage people to just take notes of daily thoughts and daily journal on actually how you're feeling at a more in-depth level, and do multiple check-ins with yourself every day, a couple times a day.
Any other like resources?
I know like James
tangible-
Fetterman, he has like a whole website on microdosing. A lot of it's really great. Just go to YouTube and type in like microdosing talks or James Fetterman microdosing, and like there's a lot of good lectures on that. And so I'd say Paul Stamets.
MAPS is also still looking for a couple of people to participate in a study that they're running. I would look on their website. but it's where you obviously supply yourself with your own materials, and then you report back once a day and answer questions. So that's something of interest to you too. That study's still open.
Cool.
We should take more questions by a raise of hands. And
There's another
just keep them like
That's
short questions,
Like-
not particularly like stories or anything like
Go
that.
ahead.
So do you understand it's a nutrient that adds something to your brain chemistry, or is it a stimulant that actually forces something out that's already there?
I would say, go ahead, Richard. Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
that's one.
yeah, I would say nutrient. Like, you know, when I think of like a stimulant, I think of coffee that has like caffeine that's taking like an endogenous form of energy and just injecting it into your system. And then once you've spent that caffeine molecule, you're just like not any healthier and actually more fatigued than you were before. Whereas like psilocybin and really like most herbal medicines and the like adaptogen nervine category are actually like nourishing the systems that are already working in you and just helping them to work.
More like a food than a drug.
For yeah, I mean definitions, but yeah,
So-
a food nutrient rather than like a like ethnogenic ceremonial like
Yeah.
thing.
And it's an alkaloid that is it's tryptamine. It's one of the true hallucinogenics. There's a whole category of true hallucinogenics that function on your serotonin receptors. I forget the number of the receptors, and then there's a whole category of hallucinogenics who don't work on those receptors, and those are not the quote unquote true hallucinogenics. But it's very sharp. It's like it basically binds to your serotonin receptors, and so it's kind of like part of the functionality of it. So yeah, I'd say it's more nutritive than a drug. Also, just in like the experience is very fulfilling and gratifying.
I think serotonin might be a psychedelic, but we're just so used to it.
Yeah.
It's always.
Yeah, and I don't know too much about this, but there is like a lot of talk about contraindications between serotonin medications and fungi, which has all of these serotonin effects. So if you're taking SSRIs, which are a lot of antidepressants, I wouldn't say like don't try, stay away completely from psilocybin, but start with small doses and notice, like journal about your mood and notice if your mood is being helped or set more erratic from that. It's all serotonin receptors and agonists.
I would recommend doing a lot of research on that.
Yeah.
If you do take SSRIs, I think that's why Kanye's not crazy, but.
Yeah, it's an area of concern.
No, I think
Any
he
other
did, like,
questions?
some crazy things.
Yeah, Victory.
So I know Amanita has higher muscimol and ibotenic acid in the spring than in their fall. So I'm curious if psilocybin is the same way. Do you have a season where it's higher or more?
Well,
I mean,
it's-
there's only one season.
It's hard because the species generally are not like, oh, they fruit in the fall or fruit in the spring. It's generally like with the philosophy species, it's either fall or spring. You don't have them kind of going across that area. I haven't necessarily seen a higher concentration in like when during the year, but even in a given patch, any different mushroom will have a different content of psilocybin. It's not something that's uniform across the board. That's why dosages with fresh material is hard. That's why a lot of people are synthesizing in the lab, so you can get a very standard dosage with it.
I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. I think that was the end of my thought, though. Yeah, I don't notice that. I mean, definitely between species.
Sure.
You see the dung-loving mushrooms are less potent than a lot of the wood-loving mushrooms. The wood-loving mushrooms are pretty potent. And then you even think about age of things. You think about a cubensis mushroom. It's a relatively short-lived mushroom. It grows in dung, and there's a lot of disturbance in those environments. And you think about something like cyanesins. They are a strict decomposer. They'll live in wood chips and periodic fruit over and over again, but eventually something comes through, disturbs them, and they move on. Azarescents, a little longer lived. They're, technically have been shown to be the most potent of all the psilocybe mushrooms. And then you take something like Amanita muscaria, which in mycelial mat can live for hundreds of years.
Right.
And you think about just kind of like the life cycle of these fungi in tandem with the experiences that they give. Something like Amanita, which is just like very deep, heavy medicine, which that's one I would not recommend to the average person. Like, you really have to have your shit together if you're going to go on a dosage of that. Yeah, because if not, it's going to take you for a loop, or it's gonna do nothing. I was once with a group of 6 people, accidentally dosed all of us on Amanita muscaria. Yeah, I cooked it
He
wrong.
loves telling the story.
And I was with the 6 people, and half the group was like, it felt like I ate a gram of mushrooms. I laughed and like grew some stuff. A friend of mine got really sick. I had to like vomit, but then just had these really weird body experiences where I was like having to stretch all over the place, and we were basically having this like tea ceremony, and like I would go down to grab the cup, and it was like the hardest thing. It was like, whoa, like I'm going to get the teacup. Okay, got it. Now I gotta go back up. Like, oh my god. Like I was trying to I was like moving 1,000 miles per hour, but also like insanely slow. And then I ended up passing out on this concrete floor, and like literally like this. So I passed out on the concrete floor like this or something. And I woke up in the morning and like all of my like back pain that I usually hold was just non-existent. Stayed like that for a month. Didn't have that back pain. Another friend of mine had a pretty cool experience. And my other friend, Talia, she disappeared into the woods and into the desert. Didn't come back until morning. Came back being like, I had the most spiritual experience my entire life. So I'm gonna like, depending on what you need, it'll teach you a lot of things.
True. And I just
Also, I'm sorry. The one thing I'd like to add, there is literature showing that once the mushroom cap opens up all the way for psilocybin species, that it's not going to produce any more psilocybin. So like a lot of people like to grow their mushrooms really, really big because they want to sell more weight. But once the cap is open, it's not going to produce anymore. So once it gets to that more weight, then you're going to be getting less psilocybin per gram in those dosages. So that's something that's good to keep in mind. And I'm not sure if that is the same across the board, but that literature is based on cubensis, which is the most commonly cultivated one. I would like to hear what you had to say before we jump over to
Oh, sure. I just wanted to make sure, just because we haven't named it, but Amanita is muscimol and ibotenic acid, and it's totally different than psilocybin.
Totally.
So psilocybin is serotonin receptors, as they've said, and ibotenic acid and muscimol work on your GABA receptors. So they're a totally different category.
It's like
it's another night, I think.
it's like
Thank you.
salvia.
Yeah, it is. There's also many different psychoactive compounds found in mushrooms besides psilocybin. There's baeocystin, and there's
Paul actually just did a report on baeocystin consumption. He found the source of it. He took it. He said it made him like feel really happy and good, but he didn't get like any visual psychoactive.
There was also just like 2 days ago, like just in time for this panel, this cool conference called the Science and Non-Duality Conference released this really awesome video of Paul Stamets that I posted to the panel Facebook event, but it's called The Treasure. It's brand new. It's like it's called The Treasure of the Psilocybes, and it's just like Paul Stamets talking for 45 minutes about all the different species of psilocybe and their current legal status and where to find them, and like it's like a pretty awesome video. So that's a good resource.
We have time for one more question. We kind of like went over our mark. I saw you had your hand up.
Well, maybe actually, how about in like a simpler terms as possible, both of y'all ask your questions, and then we'll try to like answer them both in the same idea.
So mine was kind of based on what you guys were all talking about, how everyone had a different experience when they ate this stuff. We've been microdosing for a while, and friends and family, and I've noticed even like when microdosing as well, like even mushrooms grown like from clone, so they should be like all the same in terms of potency wise. Everyone has always like different experiences with it. And do you think that's like genetic with our receptors and how they activate with it? Because like, one person can eat 3 grams and like you said, just giggle, and the other person can eat 3 grams and be in like an almost DMT trip. So
sensitivity is just where we're at. You see this with any plant medicine, not just psychoactive plant medicines, but some people can take like 1 drop of like valerian root and be like passed out, and then somebody can take like 5 dropperfuls and be like, I don't feel anything. So just I have panic attack. So it just depends. Yeah, probably a combination of epigenetics, your sensitivities, like how you've been in relationship to your nervous system, your diet, your relationship to trauma, family history, blah, blah, blah.
Would you say even if those people like on a microdose scale didn't feel the dosage that most people do, are they still getting the benefit from it?
Yeah.
It's a nutrient. It's like, if you eat a really good meal and even if you don't feel it the next day, like it's good.
It's good for you. I don't know. An interesting thing is like even if you're growing mushrooms like cubensis, if you have a monotub, same substrate producing multiple mushrooms, every different fruiting body has a different content of psilocybin. It is not uniform, even if you have the same strain. That one growing there could be twice as potent as the one growing next to it. So that's why weight is really not a good determination of strength. Unless you dehydrate it and then pulverize it and with like multiple mushrooms, then you get homogenize it, you get some kind of uniform dosage, which a lot of people do if they're microdosing. But if you're just eating the mushroom itself, it's almost like playing Russian roulette.
I also think, as far as like experiences go, I think that it is slightly genetic, and it's also like where you're at mentally. Because in my own personal experience, this is all I can speak from, honestly. But I've taken psychoactive type substances with my brother. We have similar genetics. He has a different dad than I do, but even with just cannabis, like he'll smoke like a tiny amount and he'll just be like gone, and like I can just lots of hash, whatever, and just be nobody could even tell, you know. And it's the same. I just think I've always found it to be really interesting. Like I've taken massive amounts of psilocybin with people that only taken a gram. I mean, even my first time with like LSD type experience, I took 2 and my friend took 1, and he was just like, gone. And I was like, just learning and taking a lot of information and reading books and things like that. So it's always
evolution.
I feel like it's just different, and like I don't have anybody that's genetically similar. I don't have a clone. So like it's not even something you could really test like how it's going to be. But I do think a lot of it is. I think a lot of it is mental. Like I think a lot of it is like where you're at in your head, and it might not even be like a tolerance thing, because there's people that can smoke weed every day and still get obliterated, and people that can smoke weed every day and like not just be normal person. You know what I mean? So like.
You're just like your father. If 10 is something will kill you, you're taking 9.
Well, it is like it does parallel, I'm sure, also just like alcohol, or a lot of substances are based partly on your body weight too.
Yeah, body weight.
The size of you can make a big difference. Where like someone half your size eats the same amount of you, they're twice as high as you.
Period in the story. Give me whatever, I'm gonna be. I can't even have a cup of coffee.
Lord.
Yeah.
Last question, and we got to make it quick because we're like over time.
Yeah, so it was. I'm interested in this whole clinical idea and gathering data and legitimizing this whole idea, and that in tandem with what Rishi's saying about combining these things on a microdose level with other things like adaptogens or lines. Like, are there is it Johns Hopkins who's doing the depression studies right now? Is there somebody doing like
cross pollination?
Yeah, like
I'm
legitimizing.
doing
I know you're doing is
personally.
Is there like a university that's like austere?
I don't think anyone is.
No, because
currently doing
it's
that.
still just like the
It's also
condition.
synthesized. That's what they do.
Yeah.
That's where they're gonna get their ideas from, though. Like, the ideas come from the underground. Like, because there are people like Reishi or whoever else that's doing it. That's how it's gonna eventually get into academia. They don't just come up with that. Like, some kids, they're gonna have this experience, maybe from Reishi, and he's gonna go to college and he's gonna be like, "This is what I want to study."
No, we're gonna push it forward. I disagree. Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying, but.
As far as legitimizing,
No, I agree with everything you're saying. I completely do, but I also feel as though I don't want to take that for an answer anymore. So if we want to sit and do this, let's freaking do it, and you and me will go run with it, because I'm just done. I really am,
That's it,
I am done.
Throwing it down.
Yeah, and I think that we're in a space now where things are more safe, but also where there's a lot of people are intrigued. People want answers, people are fed up, and they're also done. So I think that it's not hard to go get funding and go partner and get together and get this mycelial network rocking and rolling. And I don't think there's any reason why we wouldn't be able to just take it to the top.
I mean, wasn't our founding fathers that said it's like your civic duty to break unjust laws?
Yeah. No, I agree.
Let's all break unjust laws. Cool. Well, thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you guys so much.
And also, super big gratitude and round of applause for Nicole, who's the facilitator of today, and being so cool about this happening, this despite like stigma and everything about like hosting a psychedelic panel. So thank you, Nicole, for being open to this happening. It has felt really awesome. And we're going to be transitioning out of the space, but quickly, if you would like to get any of Pasteurized products that are really good for combining with psilocybin or in general, they're over at that shelf over there. Maybe super quickly we can talk about what we have. I have a lion's mane tincture with lion's mane that I grew myself and tinctured with organic cane spirits, and really nice for taking high doses with microdosing and psilocybin. And then I also have an elderberry reishi syrup with turkey tail chaga, artist conch, some other things. They're both 25, but you can just pay whatever is affordable to you.
And I make food as medicine products. If you're any